evening, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. This is episode number 46, and tonight we're going to continue talking about the bad guys. Bad guys. Especially in the Peter Jackson trilogy, with occasional glances towards the Hobbit trilogy, and also perhaps some comparison with the Rings of Power as well. Last time we talked about Sauron and the Ringwraiths, principally. We were looking at the very delicate sort of interpretive and adaptation dance that they were maneuvering through when they with the whole flaming eyeball business with Sauron last time. And we talked about the Ringwraiths and the way, again, that they were kind of thinking interestingly about taking very similar figures, which was very close to the text in many ways, but yet actually shifting, making choices to shift the way we respond to them, the kind of effect that they had, and how that worked. Very well at the beginning, in my opinion, less well at the end. But anyway, today we wanted to continue that because there are a couple major figures that we did not get to discuss. Saruman, of course, who's the sort of the subordinate. He's the... Well, if Sauron is the big bad, does that make Saruman the medium bad?
Mediocre bad?
Mediocre bad? He's
middle bad?
Middle bad? Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, so we should talk about him. Obviously, he's the one who is the dominant figure there in the second film, as far as the bad guys are concerned. And then we need to talk about the Orcs, who, of course, are more...
The army of bad.
Yeah, the army of bad. Yeah. Anyway, so let's start by talking about Saruman, because the Orcs are kind of a bigger kind of messier subject. With Saruman in particular, one of the things that so first of all, when we first get introduced to Saruman as bad guy in the Fellowship of the Ring, right? He gets linked to that. He is a subordinate bad guy to Sauron is emphasized from the beginning. And there's an interesting sort of effect to me. I'm thinking of the Palantir, right? And the way that the Palantir is introduced in that first conversation with Gandalf, right? Yeah. Where Saruman, for some reason, takes Gandalf in and is like, I want to show you my shiny ball that I communicate with Sauron, right. Through. And in other words, with the Palantir, we several times see the fiery eyeball in the Palantir, right? And so Saruman, over the course of the first film, and even through the second film, build me an army worthy of Mordor, right? Becomes... We talked about their choice to not have Sauron have a corporeal presence on stage, right?
Yep.
So it's almost like Saruman becomes Sauron's actual representative. Like, here's a glass ball with, here's like a big marble with a disembodied voice coming out of it and the fiery eyeball that you can see within it. And then there's a dude, right? A dude with creepy long fingernails standing there right next to it. And then he becomes the sort of embodied onstage focus, who is literally working out the will, right, of Sauron as it is communicated to him through the Palantir. I'm not trying to be like reductionist of Saruman exactly, but it just, in part, Maggie, I'm kind of asking, this is just because, like, from a film standpoint, like, and how they're kind of rolling this out in the film, that's my impression. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's probably big that we talk about the Palantir a little bit too, because when I first saw the use of that, not just as a prop, but as a facilitator, and seeing it the whole way through the trilogy and seeing Pippin being called to it, Pippin sneaking, up to it, seeking it out, like feeling that pull and then taking it and not being able to let go and then feeling what looked like pain. 100% it looked like the Palantir was using him as a conduit. So like you see it as a pathway to the dark side, right? To mix my metaphors. So you see it as like something that can assert its power over you. So therefore it is the reach of Sauron in the film. So that just became like a clear definition. So then when you go back and watch it and you see Saruman have one, it seems, oh, he has already been tainted and now he's trying to lure Gandalf in. It serves as this kind of tool, you know, and it really did seem kind of like a come into my chambers to see the shiny ball, but really it's so I can trap you and reveal to you the power that I have. You know, it definitely felt like the tool that was being used.
Yeah.
Which isn't the feeling I got from the books. Like obviously it's a tool, but I don't feel like it had that kind of assertiveness in the text. But
yeah, well, so I mean, what I'm really focused on is how it brings us to think about Saruman as a bad guy. Like, so one of the things in the book, we of course don't. One of the major differences with Saruman is that we get him much sooner. Right, like when Gandalf goes to Isengard, we see it, right? Like we go there with him in real time, as it were, and we check in with Gandalf as viewers watching the story. Like we're watching the story unfold in real time, until we get the escape in flashback. The I was delayed passage, right, from Rivendell. But the rest of it we seem to get in real time. Like we know what's happening with Gandalf. At least that's the impression that the film gives. Whereas, of course, in the book, we're getting the whole thing in flashback. Like we don't know a thing about what happened, apart from the little dream vision that Frodo has of Gandalf pacing around on top of a tower. But we don't have any real sense of what's going on with Gandalf in real time. And it's only revealed out, and Gandalf tells the whole story from start to finish in the Council of Elrond after the fact. And when I think about Gandalf's story, so I'm saying this because that seems important. I'm not 100% sure why it's important, but that seems important, that we are made a sort of an immediate dramatic viewer of the reveal of Saruman and Gandalf's initial encounter / conflict with him, right? But in the book, it is made clear that Saruman has been influenced by Sauron. Yes, he is communicated with him in the Palantir. But Gandalf is quite explicit about the fact that Saruman is still trying to feather his own nest. It is not... Saruman in the film seems to be a loyal servant of Sauron, essentially, all the way through. Saruman is not building an army of orcs because he was commanded to build an army worthy of Mordor. That's a really interesting readaptation of a line, which is it's almost that line in the book, but it doesn't come from Sauron to Saruman. It comes from Gandalf's describing what he's seeing. That he's seeing that Saruman is building an army. And it's not like, an army that could challenge Mordor quite yet, right? Not without the ring. But Gandalf is looking at what Saruman is doing, and Gandalf himself, again, remember him telling the story after the fact. Retrospectively, Gandalf says, comparing and contrasting, there are obvious similarities between what Saruman is doing and what Sauron is doing. But he's building his armies for himself, Saruman is. I think that's so. Do we see? Am I forgetting? Do we see any hint in the films that Saruman is like his purpose? Why he's building his power is for himself, like that he plans to betray.
No, the whole time he's just under Sauron and trying to do the will of Sauron.
Yeah.
You don't get that kind of selfish vibe. That's a really interesting choice of the text, though. I didn't realize the line was that close to the text. So you can see them trying, this is my thought anyway, that they would be trying to build up the big bad, and using the text that they have to kind of add fuel to the fire to make that work, and utilizing that text as a nice little nod, but we are going to change some things so the big bad is a clear big bad.
Yeah, I mean,
we didn't have time for the nuance of a selfish Saruman.
Yeah, it's almost like they don't. In the book, Gandalf is clearly. That's not just Gandalf. Tolkien is clearly building up a kind of triangle, right? Like you've got the good guys trying to survive, and you've got Sauron and Saruman, literally one on each geographically, one on each side of them, who is threatening them, and with them trapped in the middle between the two of them. Now, they are allied together, right? But they're also separate and in competition with each other. And Saruman knows that he can't possibly compete long-term with Sauron unless he gets the ring, right? But anyway, that is what it seems to me like the big picture. If I had to say like the biggest adaptation choice that they seem to have made about Saruman, it seems to be that he is not at any point even a potential rival to. So I mean, he clearly wants to. He wants to get the ring, but I don't think that he. Do we even get the sense? Are we even given the sense in the films that Saruman wants the ring for himself?
No, I mean,
I don't think so.
He doesn't strike me as selfish. I mean, I guess you can say that he wants power, and he sees that path as giving him power, but not for his own glory.
Right. Yeah, it's the interesting thing about this in some ways is that the films create a Saruman who is more selfless than the Saruman of the books, in which case, like, kind of less evil, actually. Like, he's a good soldier, Saruman is. And I mean, that might be an exaggeration, but it's an interesting. I know, well, but it's an interesting kind of side effect, right? That we're not really prompted. I mean, it's not like we're not prompted to see Saruman as a threat. The way that he takes center stage in the second film, especially, shows like obviously he's like the Rohirrim think he's a threat for sure. Like that's. I'm not saying that he's he doesn't pose any danger. I'm just saying that we see him doing it as the an extension of Sauron all the way through, not for his own glory, right? But only, not to us, but for thy glory, Sauron, is like what, Saruman is doing all the way through. And that's, I find that a really fascinating choice.
Shift. Yeah. And it's kind of reminding me what we were talking about with the Nazgul and the Witch King in the last one, that, it's a shame he didn't get to be his big bad self in the final. And I do kind of think that's because Sauron was the only one that was allowed to be the big bad. So they made everybody else the level bad. So maybe that was the reasoning with this too, that we needed a big bad to push the drama through the first and second film that would lead up to the Sauron.
Right.
So,
well, I see people commenting about, the risk of Christopher Lee upstaging Sauron too much.
Yeah.
And I hear that. I mean, but this is not, even like questions about, the performance of Christopher Lee aside, even just when you have one nebulous, literally faceless bad guy lurking in the background and another one front and center, it's very logical, right, to sort of lose sight of the one instead of the other. I mean, there's that deliberate moment in the book when Saruman is defeated, right? When Gandalf is like, okay, everybody, and now it's time to focus on the real big bad, right? Like, great victory, everybody. Good job. We've all survived against the odds. And so now it's time to begin the next and actually significantly larger challenge, right? And I felt like in some ways they were wanting to avoid or I think back to the passage sorry, I often call them passages still in films, which I suppose works, but it shows I'm used to thinking about books. The scene in the film that you already pointed to, that is Pippin in the Palantir, right? That seems to be the moment that they use in the films as the transition, right? To show like the Palantir becomes a through line, right? You've defeated Saruman, and you find Pippin finds the Palantir, right? And but now the power of Sauron comes through it. Even the way that it bursts into flame, which visually is incredibly cool, right? Even to the point of like the burning Palantir rolling across the floor and then getting smothered in the with the blanket. It just as you were saying, that is visually representing the power of Sauron coming through the Palantir, right? It's not just a communication conduit, right? It's not, I mean, like, you could call Sauron on your cell phone and your cell phone's not going to catch on fire, right? Like, that's
or possess you. I mean, that's an actual reach of power that affects your day. Like, he's not okay after that.
Yeah, exactly. So but the way that it seemed to form a through line, right, is that it just, showing that impact on Pippin helps us to imagine, imagine the impact it was having on Saruman, right? Yeah. It really declares like, okay, so Saruman, who was, within the context of film 2, the big bad, right? I mean, he was the one who was the focal point, and it gets defeated at, his armies anyway get defeated at the end, and then we do the trip to the tower that got cut out, or mostly cut out anyway. We do that at the beginning of the Return of the King, right? So they use notice even there, the confrontation with Saruman. The final one, the one where in the film he gets killed, right? Yeah. Is so much less. There's so much less of it. Even, and then of course, like, they cut it obviously from the theatrical version, which was probably, I think, the most sensational cut. Like if you I think if you make a list of the scenes that got cut from the and put back in the extended edition, I think this has to be the most controversial one. That they didn't even bother to kill Saruman on screen. He just vanishes. Yeah. It's like, well, Saruman is in his tower, whatever, but like, we don't care about him anymore. We're moving on.
He's not a threat. Just ignore all that other stuff he could do beforehand. Because the other thing with Saruman, like, not only is he, the arm of the reach of Sauron and just, really terrible character, he's also a wizard. So like, we've got some like super powers attached to this also negative ability that you don't, it's not fallible.
Right. But see, again, like, the film has, by removing any emphasis on Saruman's own motives, on his own powers, on his, I mean, it's not that I don't want to exaggerate too much with his own powers, but honestly, what does Saruman do? What is Saruman capable of? Himself. I mean, not just like he's an inconvenient agent of Mordor. Well, convenient for Sauron, inconvenient for everybody else. What else? What else does, and he's got a, like a tower, which is cool, and apparently can build an army, which is his like access to orcs and the ability to build an army. And we'll come back to that when we talk about orcs. But anyway, we see his, the weird, awkward combat with Gandalf, right? But do we even get? We get his possession of Theoden, the possession of Theoden is what basically. I'm trying to isolate exertions of power, like independent exertions of power by Saruman. He's clever, right? He's like he's a good leader. He's building his army, making his speech from the balcony, right? Like some. Like some dictator or something, right? Speaking from his balcony to his army about how they're going to eradicate men, and
he causes that avalanche.
Yeah, good. Yes, yeah. I always forget about the Carothros thing because it's so weird. Yeah, his making of gunpowder, which is just like he's intelligent, right? That's 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 not even apparently that doesn't even seem to be Saruman the wizard, just Saruman the slightly advanced chemist, right?
It's kind of reminding me of I don't know if you ever read Crystal Cave, Mary Stewart. It's a Merlin lovely Merlin trilogy. So it's the story of King Arthur through the eyes of Merlin, and she kind of demystifies Merlin through the whole thing. Right. So instead of him being a wizard with stars and moon on his hats, he's an engineer, but nobody else understands engineering, so therefore it's magic.
Right.
Yeah, it's just that kind of idea. Like, how much can we explain away?
Yeah. Even a similar move to what Mark Twain made in Connecticut Yankee. The engineering in place of magic thing. So okay, anyway, so but I agree.
Good point.
Causing the avalanche, that was an exertion of power from a distance. He calls down the lightning and makes the avalanche happen on Carothros. Even like perceiving them from there seems kind of a big deal. So that is a clear exertion of power, though in the Fellowship of the Rings, not the Two Towers. So it helps to establish him as a big, but we never see him doing that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, like, I guess maybe we see more of Gandalf doing similar things, and therefore we assume Saruman, who is maybe the leader of our order, is more powerful. But even that, we're not threatened by his magic, right? Because it doesn't really do much.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to do is, I'm thinking in terms, as we always try to do, of the choices that they're making in this adaptation, right? What was the line they were trying to walk with Saruman? They want to make him an obvious threat, but I think it seems to me that the choices that they made about him the pattern seems to be to diminish him, to make him clearly below Sauron. They didn't want to have, where in the book he is explicitly put forward as a rival to Saruman. In the film, they seem to have wanted to prevent our seeing him as a real rival to Saruman. He's a danger. He is a threat. But he's not Sauron. He's not in Sauron's league. Now, in the book, you can say he's not in Sauron's league either, but he thinks he can be, and he wants to be. And of course, remember, one of the other things that Tolkien is doing in the book, which I think is they took off the table in the films, was Sauron is a little glimpse of what it looks like when one of the good guys goes bad. And that prospect is put in front of us forcibly at the Council of Elrond. Like, we are told, if any one of the good guys claims the ring for themselves and tries to use it to overthrow Sauron, they're going to go bad, right? And we get, of course, the famous warning from Galadriel, right, about like the famous hypothetical, what she would be like if she took the ring.
A queen.
But we don't. But also, Tolkien gives us Saruman to show us, here's what it looks like. Here's a glimpse of one of the powerful good guys going bad and setting himself up in rivalry to Sauron. Now, he doesn't have the ring, but this in itself actually almost elevates Saruman, right? This is what Saruman can do without the ring. It's just him on his own, right, as a free agent. With the ring, imagine what Saruman would be able to do. He would be, clearly, stronger than Sauron. So see how that would work right now. Imagine Gandalf or Galadriel or even Aragorn first turning evil, and then or one whichever order it goes, right, taking up this power and turning evil. So it's that I think is again one of the choices that Tolkien is making, one of the functions that Saruman is performing in the narrative of the Lord of the Rings book story. But as I say, they kind of took that off the table in the Council of Elrond in the film when they're like, nobody else but Sauron. It doesn't work for anybody but Sauron, right? We can't use it. It's like, we can't use it not in the sense of it would be a super bad idea for us to use it, but in the sense that, like, it's just inoperable for anybody but Sauron. Which is weird because they contradict that with the keeping this. It's a sensible choice to keep Galadriel's awesome speech about, I mean, the lines that she says when she is, in photo negative color are almost exactly her lines from the book. I mean, that's a very direct quote, and sensibly so, because they're awesome lines. Like, don't fix what ain't broke. But it doesn't make much sense if nobody but Sauron can use the ring, which is what we were told before. But anyway, maybe that's not a contradiction so much as a reflection of their ignorance. But
I guess I might need to relook at those lines, but that's not the vibe I got from it, I guess. Like, it's not that it's inactive, it's just it will make you bad, so it's not usable for us because we won't get what we want out of it.
I'm trying to remember who says it. Is it Aragorn? It's when it's the whoever speaks up in response to Boromir's "It's a gift."
It's a gift.
Speech. And I think it's Aragorn. I think it's Aragorn who, or no, Legolas.
Yeah,
yes,
I think
you cannot
Legolas.
Wield it. None of us can.
None of us can.
And there's I seem to remember an even more direct line where they're like, it responds to Sauron alone or something like that. I mean, I think it's made explicit. Now, again, that doesn't mean that the person who said it is necessarily right. They might be. Galadriel might know something they don't know, right? But yeah, okay, it is Aragorn who says it. Madagascar. I have a vague memory of hearing this in Viggo Mortensen's voice, so I think that sounds right to me. Anyway, like I said, it's possible to kind of put too much into that, and maybe even the filmmakers change their mind, after that. But
that does continue to raise the big bad of it, right? Like, it only works for Sauron, and it, like, just imagine what those two combined could do, because just this guy without a ring, look at the mess he's making. Yeah. So, I guess I can see that elevating it.
It is interesting. So Alan Wilds asks a really interesting question here. How much did the filmmakers choose to portray the wizards in what we based on what we understand of wizards in popular culture that doesn't equate to wizards in Tolkien's world? That is so. That's a great question. And coming back, Maggie, to the Merlin example. I mean, Merlin is clearly, in popular culture, one of the wizards who looms very large in popular imagination, right? I mean, I think that Merlin is one of. I mean, if you ask,
everybody knows him.
Yeah, ask like a random person on the street for an example of a wizard, and Merlin is going to be, I think one of your top responses. Gandalf would be up there too, but especially though post Peter Jackson, pre Peter Jackson, I think it's Merlin all day long. Is the most famous wizard, and the main thing, Alan, that I would. And maybe I'm just thinking about this because I'm thinking about like what we've been already saying about Saruman and how he was depicted. But Merlin, the paradigm of Merlin is not of wizard king, right? But of like wizard as like servant of the king, right? Like
prophet of the king.
Yeah, like you have a wizard
of the court.
Yeah, like the one who is in charge may have a wizard whom he can deploy, in various ways. Like the wizard is the weapon of the king. And they're even, it's not just Merlin. Like there are other resonances, even actually in the Bible, this comes up a lot. That is like, Pharaoh and the king of Babylon, and they've got like, they've got staff sorcerers that they call out, I
was going to say dream interpreters
at times of need. Yeah, exactly. So this idea of like, not that the wizard makes himself king, right? And because he has magic, he rules the realm, but rather his magic makes him the most useful servant of the king, and so puts him in this privileged position, but he's not king, right? And it's interesting because that's a similar kind of like Saruman is like Sauron's Merlin in some sense, right? I mean, there's a I'm not saying the relationship is exactly the same, but in that sense of like Sauron has many servants, but his most powerful and most useful is, his pet wizard Saruman, who is also geographically removed and so through Saruman he is controlling Rohan through the possession of Denethor, and he's building another army which can attack them from the other side, but it's all strategy, right? And I agree. Madagot, then the Witch King is number 2, right? Or number 3, I guess, if Sauron is 1. But anyway, sorry, go ahead, Maggie.
No, I was just agreeing with Phil. Jafar and Aladdin, the evil vizier type,
yes, exactly.
This powerful character.
That seems to be the archetype, right? That they are,
which also
invoking.
means exactly. Which then means it's recognizable. So, if you take Saruman out of this power grubbing character that wants to overthrow and be in charge himself and put him into this space of supporting the king, we get that makes sense. And comparing him to other like tropes of wizard, that would be a fun exercise of just how is this one different.
Well, and another thing, I mean, and I know this is up your street too, Maggie, is to look at the impact that Harry Potter has on that 100%. Whole concept, right?
And I mean, Merlin's even in Harry Potter, so like, how did they mess with the whole perception of known wizards in the wizarding world?
Yeah, I mean, the alternate history again, even of Merlin, and you think of the role that Merlin has in Harry Potter. I mean, it's okay; he doesn't have a huge role, but he's a historical figure of note, right? And yet the implication clearly is that the Muggle perception of, Merlin as, King Arthur's right-hand dude is probably not how the wizarding world looks at Merlin, right? That there's a totally an alternate version, but that Nameless Arcanum asks a fascinating philological question that I can't answer. Are the words vizier and wizard related? I would think so, as the word wizard is connected to wisdom. Like wise one is more or less the philological root of wizard, and I would not be surprised if vizier was similar in its roots. But no. Okay. Well,
Eric seems to have
Eric says no. Okay. Yeah, I don't know anything about the roots of vizier. It might be superficial, but in any case, the role again
reception.
Don't
apologize. It's all right.
Of wise counselor, right? Yeah. The wisest of counselors. And note, this is what how Gandalf is treated, the position he puts himself in. Even from the beginning, right? I mean, remember Frodo in chapter 2 is like, "Oh, Gandalf, wisest of counselors, tell me what I should do." Like, so that even Gandalf, so Tolkien himself is also working within this concept of the role of wizards as advisors, right? The role that Gandalf is that, not just for, he's not the pet advisor of a particular king, right? He's not on staff for any particular king to be able to, summon up when something needs to get done. But he does have that kind of counselor position.
Do we know how he came into that role? I mean, text and film. In film, I always got the vibe that he just took up a mantle, answered a call kind of a thing. But I don't know if there was more of a recruitment, if Sauron actually went out and sought him.
No, I don't think so. This seems to me to be so. All right, I'm going to try and tell a long version of this story. The shortest version I can tell of this story. We had a long discussion in exploring the Lord of the Rings about what the colors mean. The gray, the white, the brown, and that although the normal association in everybody's mind is that they're like karate belts and indicate a rank, I'm wholly unconvinced that they in fact do indicate a rank. Not that there is no rank among them. This is the hard thing, because there is rank among them. And there's a kind of correlation, but I don't think that it's merely an indicator of rank. And so when we were trying to figure out what does it mean, looking at how they're spoken of and what that means, and the theory that we came up with, and which I feel is pretty solid, is that it indicates a sphere of influence. It indicates like it's more like an academic subject than it is like a rank, right? It's a job description more than anything else. The white, to be the white, means like, so when Gandalf comes back and says, "I am the white now," I am I am now Gandalf the White. I am Saruman as he should have been, meaning I'm doing the job Saruman didn't do. Right? Saruman neglected this job, and I'm here now. And now I've been given that job, right? I've been given that role. And so one of the biggest and most interesting questions in all of this, what the job of the white is, seems pretty clear. Like, to be the leader of, like, to be working against Sauron, right? To be the captain of, the sort of organizer and leader and empowerer of everybody who is trying to fight against Sauron. That was Saruman's job. He was studying the powers of the enemy. He was studying the rings of power. He began doing that because it was his job, right? To learn about the enemy, because his job is to be the leader of the opposition of Sauron. That's why he's made the head of the council, right? Because that's his job. And then he stops doing his job. And then Gandalf is explicitly doing that job after he comes back and is the white. He's not doing that job beforehand. When he's the gray, he's not like, I shall lead the charge against Sauron. He's like, no, he's wandering around doing all kinds of... So the question was, what is the job of the gray? Like, what does that mean? And I think wandering around and like seeing where there are needs and like being the advisor of various kings in different places and stuff, that seems to be connected with what it meant to be the gray.
He's like the street crew, like,
Yes. And just as the brown seems to have something to do with like birds and beasts, right? Like like that's Radagast's job. I don't know. We know so little about Radagast. It's hard to put together a full profile of either what he did or what he was supposed to do, or how to figure out any way to talk about that. But yeah, so Alan, by saying that when Saruman says that he's Saruman of many colors, he has every job, right? He is basically saying, I am in charge of everything, right? I'm not any longer just doing my niche, even though my niche was arguably the most important niche, right? And made me the head of the council. Everything is my business now, right? Remember that when Saruman as speaking to Gandalf at the beginning before he reveals himself, he emphasizes Gandalf the Grey, and then says, what are you doing, going about the lands, sticking your nose into every business, whether it belongs to you or not, right? Gandalf has been meddling in his, Saruman's, job by his connection with the Ring of Power, right? He's discovered the ruling ring and he's kept it from Saruman, and Saruman is like, that's you're working in my area, right? You're doing my job. You have transgressed the boundaries.
I just had pizza delivered to me.
Oh, there we go. How kind.
Thank
you. Anyway, so this is what I think, again, the Gandalf the Grey was involved in that kind of roaming about. So I don't think it was his job. I don't think he was getting recruited by, I don't think it was getting recruited by kings, but he would, show up and make himself available, and the kings either did or did not appreciate it, right? Like we see both Theoden and Denethor not appreciating it particularly, right? I mean, Theoden comes to appreciate it eventually, but originally, the whole Gandalf Stormcrow thing, right? His advice is not appreciated, but he shows up, right? He keeps showing up. Anyway, okay.
I like that idea. I'd never thought of them as job descriptions, and that makes absolute sense.
I think increasingly I'm thinking that's the case. But again, see, this is exactly the kind of thing we don't get anything like this in the films, right? Like I don't think we even really. like the wizardliness of Saruman seems to be a little bit de-emphasized in some ways. I don't know.
Well, I agree with you. The only time that, because what you were saying, the thing that came into my mind was like, oh, that makes a little bit clearer. The moment in the film when he's in the blinding white light and they think it's Saruman, but it's actually Gandalf, and he kind of has to remember who he is. That moment makes sense to me in that respect, because it does feel like he's stepped into this new role and he's doing this new job, you know, and he's lived a whole life in the meantime that you kind of forgot what he was up to. But that moment kind of makes sense of stepping into this new wizardly role. But the rest of it, not as much.
Yeah. We should talk about orcs before we run out of time.
We probably should. But this is really interesting. I feel like I was one of your students there. I'm like, tell me more. This is really interesting. Digression,
but it's the kind of, it illustrates the kind of thing that I think is like the kinds of ways in which Tolkien is thinking about the wizards and wizardly roles that we just don't get in the films. And again, they, you know, to some extent, obviously, the compression of everything in films is, by the way, footnote, this is one of the things that I find hard to talk about, or slightly vexing anyway to talk about, when people complain about the time compression in the Rings of Power. And it's like, it is a translation to a visual medium. Of course it's compressed. Like, no film adaptation of anything has ever not been compressed. Like, you just can't. It's not possible to. I mean, like a book. I mean,
you can't watch 80 days of traveling around the world, you know?
No,
you just can't.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, it's there's. It is not to say that films can't convey nuance, but they're interested in different sorts of nuance because they do it in different ways, right?
Yeah,
their storytelling is of a different mode.
And one of the things I was thinking about with this that I wish I'd done before we'd started talking tonight, but I'll see if I can do it for next time, is like an actual visual comparison of Gandalf and Saruman would be really interesting. How were they shot? And you can see it just in their costumes. Like, just those decisions are huge, that we're going to relate more to the one that's a little bit scruffy with the tangled, you know, staff that looks like more organic, and he cracks a joke and he's got fireworks, you know, that's more of a relatable type character versus the cold steel sharp lines. But I do wonder how they're shot and how that kind of affects power structures. If there's like, I mean, I don't know, but I would imagine all of Saruman's shots are like straight on, taking up most of the frame, being much more powerful and in charge, whereas Gandalf's probably more on the periphery and a bit more coming in from the sides. And
it would be really interesting to look at the whole initial
visual
Isengard sequence, you know, with them, and how the two of them are presented when they are literally side by side there, right? That would be interesting.
And maybe bring in some kind of choreographer to talk about the fight scenes, because that's just funny. So
right.
Yeah, I did like the fight scenes, but you can't help but have a little bit of a giggle because it was just a little bit ridiculous. But
it is the only scene. So I just I did a Peter Jackson trilogy marathon with my kids and their friends 2 years ago. Year and a half ago now, I guess. And that's the only scene that they were just cracking up. I mean, they were in stitches with that scene.
That bit when he's spinning around.
Oh, the spinning, yeah. Oh, they were like they were giggling before that, and then when he started spinning around, they just lost it. And that was yeah. I mean, yeah.
It's a decision. I mean, I would have liked to have been at the table to hear that. Like, the meme that's been coming to me this week, it's all over Instagram and everything else, is somebody watching Twilight for the first time, and they're just laughing hysterically because there's a scene where she rides on his back and they run really fast through the woods, and it's hysterical how badly shot and you know, CG'd it is. But in the moment, nobody really thought that. But you're like, oh, I just wonder what the conversation was and what decision was made, because it doesn't age well. And for something like that to draw your focus is kind of a shame, right? Like, if this scene where we have this awesome battle between these two incredibly powerful characters, I probably shouldn't be laughing at him spinning on the floor.
Right.
right?
Yes.
We should shift to orcs.
We should shift to orcs. Okay, so we're gonna let's talk about orcs. So one of the things we mentioned last time was the progressive reveals, right? With your monsters, and this is certainly true big picture of orcs. We're talking about reveal. We're focused on the Fellowship of the Ring film.
Yep.
Right. Because they get fully revealed by the end of the film, and then they're just, standard characters in quantity in the last two films. The way they get revealed, the first time we see orcs in the Fellowship of the Ring film, we see them from a distance pulling down trees and stuff in Isengard, right, from Gandalf's perspective. But it's quite distant. They're mostly... we see them chopping.
We see them torturing Gollum, don't we?
I'm not sure if we see...
Baggins Shire.
Do we see orcs there? I'd forgotten. I don't remember seeing orcs in that scene.
I can't remember now. I guess I just assumed they're the ones that had him on the table torturing him, but maybe not.
Madagot's right. We do see orcs in the prologue, the battlefield, right? They're not progressively revealed in the same way that the orcs get deliberately and very progressively revealed in the Rings of Power, right? Yeah. That was much more...
that was classic horror film, slow reveal.
Yeah.
Every time.
Yes, the claws. Oh. Yes. So what do we get about orcs? Like, what does the first film convey to us about orcs? I'm trying to not start with the whole breeding pits Saruman's speech about the history of orcs, because that comes quite late in the film, is why I don't want to start there. Because that's not where we're asked to start. We see the mobs on the battlefield fighting the Last Alliance in the prologue, but there is very little emphasis on like the orcishness of the orcs, right? We just see a battle, like they're bad guys on the battlefield, right? And what's more, they don't seem to, like, they're losing on the battlefield until Sauron comes out, right?
So is Moria the first real?
Yeah, when they come through the ceiling down around them. That's we get them first first we get the battle in the chamber, right? And then that's the
first time we see the sword go blue as well.
Yeah, it's the first time we see the sword go blue. Exactly. Stingo. Yeah. The cockroach swarm of the goblins of Moria coming down through the ceiling, down the pillars around them, is one of the creepiest orc moments in all of Tolkien visual adaptations, in my opinion. I mean, that scene because they look very much like a massive swarm of cockroaches boiling out of a hole in the wall. It is... I don't know that orcs in Tolkien adaptation have ever seemed more purely inhuman, like more alien than they do in that scene. Yeah.
And very unsettling. When something enters a scene like that, all of us just go, oh, centipedes and spiders, and just, things with weird moving legs that creep me out.
Yes. And then you think about how then that gets played on with in the dark hall with the light of Gandalf's staff, like illuminating them, and all of those like scenes, that we get, with them kind of closing in.
I'm going to replay that in my head many times, Corey.
But again, like it's the emphasis is it's not even so much on them as physical threat, because they're individually small, right? I mean, they're not, but really, again, it's the alienness, like
And the working together, anthill type thing where like, ants can build towers and lift themselves up. Individually, orcs are kind of dumb and goofy and not super effective. They don't seem highly trained. They seem a little bit crude, but when you put them all together, they're really terrifying. And I just picture all of their faces pressing in on that one hole in the door as they're trying to come into the chamber, and it just has that kind of zombie pressing at the doors kind of feel to it.
Like zombie apocalypse kind of thing.
Yeah, like really leaning into some of those.
The same scene when Legolas shoots him in the face through the door, right? So you can see the arrow like moving around as his face is moving around. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Even that whole the whole fight scene, especially with the way that the cave troll is the obvious focal point, right? And the it's not that the goblins are no threat, but they are not made the focal point of the battle at almost any point. I mean, you've got like, Sam hitting them with his frying pan, right? But mostly once the cave troll breaks in, he's everybody's focusing on him almost all of the time. I think that the throughout the Moria sequence, the orcs seem to be presented as not a big deal, almost more insectoid, right? Like they are in a swarm, they are a serious problem. And also that like killing them doesn't accomplish like a swarm of cockroaches, killing some doesn't accomplish anything of significance, right? That's really interesting. Now, the scene that Everett and Alan on YouTube were recalling is I think a really important one. Remember when the orc underlings of Saruman come to him and ask what the eye commands, right? So like Saruman gets the build me an army worthy of Mordor order, and then the orcs come into him asking for Saruman to convey to them what Sauron's orders are, which gives the impression, interestingly, of a modicum of independence of the orcs, right? They're not just Saruman's lackeys to order around. I mean, they are Saruman's lackeys to order around, but they're delegated lackeys. And they know that their own loyalty is to Sauron first and foremost. They're obeying Saruman because Sauron told them to. And so and they don't come to him and say, "Oh, mighty Saruman, what is your command?" Right? They come to him saying, "So, did Sauron tell you what to tell us to do yet?"
Yeah, what has he said?
And if so, what is it?
Baby, sorry. Yell if you need me. I swear she knows that we're talking about horrible villains. She doesn't usually...
I hope we're not giving Hazel nightmares again.
Well, no, she doesn't usually wake up. Anyway, she doesn't usually wake up anymore, gang. So this is 2 weeks in a row talking about villains.
Yeah.
But,
sorry. Maybe we need to shift on to something more pleasant next week.
No, next time we're talking about fairies. But no, you're right. I mean, they don't have they're waiting for that autonomy isn't really theirs. They're waiting for their orders. What does the eye command? That's a very different spin on that vibe.
Yeah, again, quasi-independent, right? Like they're able to make their own choices. They're able to tell the difference between like something Saruman might tell him off his own bat, right, and something that he's conveying to them from Sauron. There's almost a sense of it would be pushing it too far to say that the orcs consider themselves Saruman's colleague, both in service to Sauron rather than, they're clearly his subordinates. But you see what I mean? Like they are his subordinates because they're both serving Sauron, and not just independently.
Right.
But I think, Everett, that's exactly right. The effect that this has, and I think in some ways I've never even really thought, I think it's clear that the film is doing this, but I never really realized it was doing this. Establishing the Uruk-hai as not only different orcs, but as orcs who uniquely answer only to Saruman. As Everett is pointing out that, that whom do you serve? Saruman, right? Like they don't serve Sauron, they only serve him, and so that so perhaps I'm underestimating in the film through the Uruk-hai. You could argue that they.
Sorry, can you give me two? Sorry.
I can. No problem.
You guys are the best. I'll be back.
Okay. That Saruman. So, do you guys think that Saruman is therefore being actually elevated to a threat or rival? I didn't see any much evidence of that in the movies independently. Like again, from Saruman himself. Saruman stating that he was, he's looking for his own power and not just to further Sauron's power. But you could argue that in establishing the Uruk-hai, he is really doing his own thing and creating his independent and superior form of orcs, right? His orcs can beat Sauron's orcs, and his more superior orcs, answer only to him. At least perhaps that sort of seed is planted there, even though, again, it does not seem to me to be a major plot point that Saruman is trying to set up on his own with his filthy white badges, right, as Grishnak says. Yeah, I agree. Nameless Arcanum says his motivation has always felt slippery to me in the movies. That I agree. It's hard for me to get a clear sense of what movie Saruman is up to there. Yes, the Uruk-hai are the ones who get the white hand. Well, they're not tattoos; it's just paint, right? Or we're shown that it's paint, but it apparently stays. Absolutely. Guy Bren, I agreed. It's in the books. There's a big contrast there. Yeah. So, let's talk. I'm tempted to wait till Maggie comes back to talk about the origin of orcs question, because Peter Jackson goes straight there, right? And actually, it's really interesting to me that both the Peter Jackson films and The Rings of Power directly and explicitly, like in dialogue, address the orc origin question, which Tolkien left so indefinite. But yeah. So Alan, I don't know that I would agree that the Uruks are basically removed after film one. I mean, we do see, like, the Orcs of Mordor are not all Uruk-hai. I mean, I think about the orcs who are fighting in the Tower of Cirith Ungol, right? And those are quite like the orcs. The, what does the eye command orcs who are, Saruman's colleagues there in film one. So okay, hang on. I think we're having a vocabulary question. So there's the Uruk-hai, and then there's the Uruks, which is a different breed entirely from the Uruk-hai. That's the differentiation. So Saruman doesn't have Uruks. He has the Uruk-hai. Just to try to keep the now, I'm not trying to be pedantic about it, but just because it's important to try to talk about them consistently and make sure we're discussing the same thing. Uruk just means orc. Yeah, that's what the word means. And I might as well address the oldest, and I think still to this day, the most frequent question I've ever received in my entire career as Tolkien professor. And that is, what's the difference between goblins and orcs? And the answer is, there is not a difference between goblins and orcs. The difference is, the answer is, it's a purely linguistic difference. Yes, narrowly edging out Balrog wings is what's the difference between orcs and goblins. The difference between orc and goblin is simply linguistic. If you want to give them the English word, it's goblins. If you want to give them the Elvish name, it's orc. And Tolkien does appear to make a consistent shift, right? He's already invented the word orc, like that is, he used it in the Book of Lost Tales. So the word orc existed. He chooses to use the word goblin almost exclusively in The Hobbit. Let me rephrase that sentence. In The Hobbit, he chooses to use the word goblin almost exclusively. He does use the word orc. The word orc, of course, appears in The Hobbit once, twice, and both times it suggests that orcs are bigger and meaner than goblins, but mostly the word goblin is used, whereas in The Lord of the Rings and in the appendices, the word orc is used to describe the same events, such as the Battle of Five Armies or the fight in the mines of Moria that Thorin remembers very well in Chapter 1 of The Hobbit. All of the word orc is used to describe all of those. So it is not at all clear. In fact, let me go the other way around. It is quite clear that there is no real attempt to use, that Tolkien does not make the attempt to use the words goblin and orc consistently to refer to different breeds. He doesn't label some of them goblins and some of them orcs. Unfortunately, for the makers of video games, goblins and orcs are not separate breeds of baddies, but just different ways to talk about the same group of people. This becomes extremely clear in The Lord of the Rings when you will often have a single character using the same term in like two consecutive sentences to talk about the same creatures, right? Like the exact same people. That is, Merry and Pippin sometimes call them goblins and sometimes orcs in the Uruk-hai chapter when they're being orc dragged across Rohan. They are being orc dragged by creatures whom they sometimes call goblins during that very chapter. So what's the difference? Again, what is the impact? Why make the choice at all why have the two different terms if you're saying that there is no difference, if there's not one species of creature called a goblin and one species of creature called an orc, which is bigger and more fierce, as we see in Dungeons and Dragons, for instance, and in most video games. Why introduce the difference at all? Why use different terms? And the answer, again, for Tolkien, the primary answer was, in The Hobbit, he uses goblin almost all the time. Why does he use goblin almost all the time? And that is because he is writing a fairy tale, right? He is writing a fairy tale for children in which he is evoking the English fairy tale tradition. And goblins are very traditional bad guys. I read George MacDonald. There they are, goblins, right? And so it's not about necessarily, like, again, he's not doing world building when he calls them goblins. He's doing fairy tale storytelling when he calls them goblins. And goblins are a thing. Goblins are a very well established, you can say to an English child of the 1930s, and the mountain caves were like the mountain cave was the secret entrance to the goblins' realm. And the English child of the 1930s will be right with you. They will know what you're talking about, right? Whereas if you said to the self-same English child nothing other than, but the mountain was full of orcs, you have to explain what the heck an orc is. Right. And that's not what he was doing. He was evoking the fairy tale tradition in calling them goblins. But again, he'd already invented the word orc. Within the word orc comes from his Elvish languages. And he had already invented that word and used that word in his earlier Silmarillion writings, right? So it's still there, and he still embeds it, just as he embeds so many things from the Silmarillion in The Hobbit, in this little fairy tale that he's doing all the way through. And so, yes, the coolest example is the one that Nameless Arcanum just brought up. He tells us, Tolkien the philologist informs us Even in The Hobbit. In The Lord of the Rings, he goes even further out of his way to try to teach us some Elvish languages, right? But that is like, you think about the number of times that he tells us the name of a thing in Elvish and then gives us the translation in English, right? And thereby we begin to notice some things that, the Black Land and the Black Pit both start with more, and so more seems to mean black in Elvish, right? Things like that, we begin to be able to put together. Even in The Hobbit, he does this with Orcrist, right? The name of Thorin's sword is called Orcrist, which Elrond translates into English as Goblin Cleaver, right? And therefore, again, if you're paying close attention, you can come from that and say, the Elvish word for goblin is orc. And so you will not be surprised on the 2 occasions that the word orc is used later on when you're told about the great orcs of the mountains, right? And you know now, or it's just like another way you're being sort of equipped with that. But okay, so why did so that he shifts from goblin to orc primarily between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings is not very surprising, because he is doing The Lord of the Rings is a totally different project, right? Or by halfway through what was at the time chapter 2, that is to say, when they meet the Black Riders. Footnote: when Tolkien wrote the original story, the shadows of the past didn't exist. He wrote the long-expected party, and then in chapter 2, Frodo sets out on his own journey, and they meet the Black Rider on the road. So that's Three is Company. What is chapter 3 in the published text was chapter 2 originally. And then then the Black Rider comes in. Tolkien has no idea who it is, and he's got to figure it out. And all of a sudden, Ring Wraiths, Ring of Power, the whole story emerges, and he's got to go back and write chapter 2. Yeah. Awesome. Madagot, you're doing that in the Journey Through the History of Middle-earth with James Tower this week. Fantastic. Such a great space series, isn't it? James is so good. Anyway, so yeah. Sorry, Nameless Arcanum, you're right. I meant when Bingo sets out on his own trip, but that's a whole other story. That's like a digression within a digression within a digression. So let me work my way back upwards. The point is that once The Lord of the Rings becomes the kind of book that it becomes, that is one in which Tolkien is doing world building and is developing the world that he had developed and the story and the history of that world. He starts doing that kind of thing, and he's not doing that in The Hobbit. Like he is not doing world building in The Hobbit in the same way that he does in The Lord of the Rings. But in the world where he is doing world building, he decides they should really be called orcs primarily. Why? Because how are people, like, the average person in Middle-earth should call that creature an orc in the Third Age. Why? Well, because how did all the people of the Third Age learn to talk about these things? From the elves, right? Because the Númenóreans and everybody were influenced and taught by the elves and learned the elf languages. So like the elves began it, right? Elves began lots of things, including wars against orcs, right? So the elf name for the thing would be the thing that catches on is, I think, very sensible, right? So yes, that's exactly it, Phil. But Tolkien does think about continuity backwards with The Hobbit, right? He's willing to cut some strands there, but he does think about continuity, and he doesn't repent completely of using the word goblin. He used the word goblin in The Hobbit because it was a different kind of story, and that accomplished what he wanted to accomplish. But now that he's going in a different direction, he doesn't just cut it off entirely. He uses orc most of the time, but he still uses goblin. And when you look, it is almost always hobbits who use the word goblin, right? He decides, like the way that he retcons the use of goblin in The Hobbit, the way that he answers the retroactive question, well, why didn't you call orcs all from the beginning in The Hobbit? Because Bilbo wrote The Hobbit, and Bilbo was writing from the Hobbit framework and the word goblin. Now, what how would he incorporate that into the history of the languages of the hobbits? I do not know. I do not know, but I am sure he would have an answer. I'm sure that Tolkien could give you an etymology for the word. Because remember now, Nameless Arcanum, goblin isn't a Westron word. It's an English word. Remember, all of the Lord of the Rings is a translation, right? The Shire is not called the Shire. Sam's name is not Sam, right? All of these things. Remember the Shire, the hobbits, the word that the hobbits are actually using in Westron to talk about the Shire is Suza. It's translated as Shire, right? So the word goblin is still an English word that is being used to translate the Hobbit term. But what that means, since the hobbits are calling them goblins, that means that there is another Westron word which is linguistically independent of the Elvish word orc that they are using, and then he would have an explanation of what that Westron word was and where it came from and why it's different. And no doubt Tolkien would have that. We're not presented with that in the narrative, of course, of the Lord of the Rings. Anyway, so super long digression about goblins, but it's important because think about one of the things they do in the films, which is both understandable, but also in its way kind of interesting. Tolkien has different breeds of orcs. Remember, this is there are a couple places where this is really focused on. This comes into clear focus during the orc dragging across Rohan, when we have the three different factions, but also three different breeds. They look different and have different physical capabilities. There's the Uruk-hai of Ugluk. There are the Mordor Uruks of Grishnak. And there are the Misty Mountain Orcs who don't have a leader, right? They're just hangers-on. And both the Grishnak and his orcs and Ugluk and his Uruk-hai all look down on the Misty Mountain Orcs, who can't keep up, remember? Anyway, and who are afraid of the sunshine, of course, as we know. Misty Mountain Orcs are afraid of the sunshine. We've known that since The Hobbit, right? And Ugluk is like, we're going to keep running even when the sun comes out. Anyway, so that's one of the places in which we see very emphatically during the course of the narrative that the orcs are different, right? That there are these different breeds of orcs. One of the other passages that jumps out to me as a place that where the different breeds of orcs is particularly important is that scene in Mordor in The Return of the King, when we have the warrior orc and the tracker orc with their snotty noses. There again, we have clearly different breeds who are serving different functions, right? So again, in the book, Tolkien has clearly different breeds of orc, and the different breeds of orc have different functions. In the film, they lean more, I think, into the different breeds of orcs. They do seem to use the words goblin and orc. Is it true? I was about to say that they use those words consistently to refer to different breeds. That the goblins are they use the word goblin to mean the orcs of the Misty Mountains. And then the orcs of Mordor are just different from the goblins of the Misty Mountains. I think that's true, but there's a chance I'm wrong about that. That is about the consistency with which the film does that. But anyway, the film, I believe, plays up the different species of orcs fairly significantly, even though they're a little bit fuzzy on vocabulary there. Do you get the impression... Sorry, so one of the questions I'm asking and thinking about this depiction of the orcs in the films, do they use this to... Does it have an impact on how we respond to the orcs? In the books, seeing the seeing the different orc, Eric, as you were just saying, no, sorry, I'm looking at a different comment. Yes, Nemos Arcanum was just saying the sort of the window into the horror that is orc ethnic tension in that chapter. Yes, Nemos Arcanum, in other words, what you're pointing to there is that we are brought to imagine ourselves into orc. Like, we're given an inside view. What is it like to be an orc, right? What is orc life? What is orc civilization like? We get that in several places. We get that with Grishnak and Ugluk. We get that with Shagrat and Gorbag, very pronouncedly. We even get a glimpse of it with the hunter and the tracker, right? Hey, Maggie.
Oh my God. I don't know if Allie jumped on here or not, but we're having like the worst meltdown I've ever witnessed from her.
Oh dear.
I'm so sorry, guys.
It's all right. You can go. It's fine. We're soldiering on talking about orcs.
Oh, bless. I hope you're falling down a wonderful hole, because I think I'm going to be crawling in bed with her, which I've never done before. So,
okay.
Sorry, guys. Thank you.
No problem. Go take care of your baby.
Thanks, babe.
Bye. All right. Yeah. So it's interesting to me that Tolkien gives us that. It's in a sense, Tolkien, I think, serves, especially through Shagrat and Gorbag, to humanize orcs more than we get in the films. Does it seem right to you? Well, I'm almost out of time, so let's go ahead and talk about the orc origin thing. For a long time, the scene in the Fellowship of the Ring when Saruman is lecturing the Uruk-hai, the newly spawned Uruk-hai, about the origin of orcs. For a long time, that was my least favorite scene in the Fellowship of the Ring. And in some ways, it's still the scene. It's still the scene that I bear the most personal grudge against Peter Jackson to, because of just the number of hours of my life that have been spent over the last 20 years trying to explain things to confused people who watch that scene. I feel that Peter Jackson owes me for dozens and dozens of hours of my life. It is confusing, to say the least. On the one hand, Saruman is narrating. So, my biggest problem with that scene has always been what we are hearing and what we are seeing do not match each other in any way. We are hearing from Saruman in his little orc history lecture to the Uruk-hai that orcs are derived from elves, that they were elves once. And then in the meantime, we are watching them being spawned out of mud pits somehow, as if they are being made like, as if they're being constructed in Frankenstein's lab, right? What are they, animated corpses? Are they, right? I mean, like, they look like they're coming out of a grave. What exactly are they? What does Saruman's description of the, you were elves once, like, is it them? Are the orcs are the Uruk-hai, or Saruman's Uruk-hai test tube babies in some sense? What has he done precisely to protect them, or not protect them, to perfect them? That's the word I meant, right? It says, and now perfected, he says, right? What is it, right? Josh, I agree. It is as if it's a big womb or something that they're coming out of, right? Yes, it's birth-like, except there's no body, right? There's no mom that they're emerging from. we don't know. Now here, on the one hand, I don't want to complain too loudly, because what Peter Jackson has done there, on the one hand, of course, he's added this sort of like horror movie element, right, of them like emerging from the slime, and there's something really viscerally horrible about that. But at the same time, he's also cleaning this up, right? He would have had a rating problem had he actually conveyed what Tolkien suggests about the Uruk-hai. What makes the Uruk-hai different from regular orcs in Tolkien's world? Tolkien is very explicit about this. That the species of humans and orcs have been crossbred by Saruman. And there is no way to depict that on screen and preserve a PG-13 rating. There's just not. So, yes. But that's what Tolkien suggests. He doesn't describe it, of course, and he doesn't talk about how it happened, and he doesn't... all he says about it is Treebeard's comment, that would be a black evil. This would be it's called the worst of all of the things that Saruman did. This is the worst. Because orcs reproduce sexually just like other creatures of their kind. So, yes, like, I think that Tolkien's every implication is that there was sexual and presumably non-consenting crossbreeding between humans and orcs. Now, we don't know. Maybe it was consensual. No idea. But in any case, it's not pretty. One way or another, it is not pretty. But that seems to be the sort of specter that is behind the Uruk-hai in the books. That Peter Jackson didn't want to go within 3 miles of that, I understand completely and can't blame him for. But the result, again, is confusion. Are they creatures emerging from the slime? Were they manufactured out of slime? Were they born and incubated and, I don't know, somehow infused with increased ferocity and awesomeness in the mud pits, and then they emerge when they're fully cooked? So instead of having childhoods, orcs are incubated in the muds. I mean, is that what we're getting? I mean, I don't know, right? I really don't know. Right. They're like petri dish babies, except, in a highly non-sterile environment. That seems to be, the visuals seem to me to invite us to imagine that. That Saruman is making orcs like from scratch in some way, right? But then again, it's at odds with what Saruman... So Saruman says, you were elves once. By which I assume Saruman means, racially speaking, like you orcs, referring to you and all of your progenitors over thousands of years. You had your origin in elves. But of course, many people watching the movies came out of the movies saying, so did Saruman kidnap elves, put them in the mud pits, and turn them into orcs? Because that seems very consistent with what Saruman says and what we've seen, right? This is why, again, the primary thing with orcs in the Lord of the Rings film. In that the reason that was my least favorite scene in the Fellowship of the Ring for many years was just that it's simply, it is so confusing that I am prepared to say that scene is simply confused, right? I don't think it's very successful in how it in what it conveys. It doesn't seem to really know what it's talking about. So Nameless Arcanum is asking, where does the made from slime with hearts of stone orc origin come from? The Book of Lost Tales. That's in the Book of Lost Tales. You've got stone and slime. There are 3 primary ingredients. Don't try to make orcs at home. Highly not recommended. But the recipe, basically, is stone and slime and hatred. The hatred is really, what makes the thing tick. But yeah, you infuse stone and slime with hatred and, bake at 350 for 25 to 30 minutes, and the result is orcs. That's in the Book of Lost Tales. Yeah, Madagod, it's funny that you bring up the nursery rhyme of sugar and spice and everything nice, right? Honestly, that is almost the register that the original orc recipe is at, right? Snips, snails, puppy dogs' tails on the one hand, and stones, slime, and hatred on the other hand. I mean, the one is slightly more mythic, but they're not, they're not miles away from each other. Nameless Arcanum, I always thought that there was a kind of nod to the stone and slime origin in the orc scene. Again, but far from finding that cool, I found that irritating and frustrating. It was as if they were trying to do it both ways, but in a totally contradictory way that made even less sense than orcs in the Lord of the Rings book makes sense. Tolkien doesn't commit, but Tolkien fails to commit by just leaving it, right? Tolkien's orcs are a problem, but you have to read his stories and then stop and think carefully about his stories and the sort of theology of his world before you even see the problem of orcs, right? It's a fairly advanced reading of the story that gets to the point where you're asking the question, what happens to orcs when they die, though, right? And do orcs have free will? I mean, that's a question that's a little closer to the surface, right? But anyway, it's not going to be every first-time reader who's thinking of the question, where do orcs go when they die, right? But when you do get around to those questions, you find that Tolkien has no good answers for you, right? Because he didn't have any good answers for that question. Instead, the Peter Jackson team decide, we're just going to front load the confusion and just leave everybody totally stumped about what's happening there. And I kind of hated it. I kind of hated it just because it just perpetuated confusion. And then again, and people when I talk about the hours that I spent, it's one of the things that the confusion that scene created lingers for years. Yeah, exactly, Alan. If you're asking the question, do orcs go to the halls of Mandos? You're already well inside the gates as far as Tolkien readership is concerned, right? Whereas again, first time, moviegoers are watching that scene and what are we talking about? How does it relate? What am I seeing? What am I hearing? How am I supposed to parse this? You're giving me something, or you're throwing all this stuff at me and I have no idea what it is. Yes. So Alan, we do want to do a comparison with the orcs and the Rings of Power. Next time, Maggie and I will come back at the risk of giving Hazel more nightmares. If Hazel wakes up next week, we're stopping talking about this stuff ever again. But at the risk of disturbing Maggie's daughter's sleep further, I would like to talk about the orcs in the Rings of Power, having discussed the use that Peter Jackson makes of them and their links to the book Orcs. I want to talk about the Rings of Power orcs and the choices that they were making in the Rings of Power, which I find are very, very interesting. The character of Adar, of course, is a fascinating character in the Rings of Power, and I'm extremely interested in him. We are on next week. So we'll be on next week, and then Mythmoot comes the week after that. So we have one more week where we'll be, and then we'll have a week interruption when I'll be at Mythmoot, and then we should be back afterwards. So next week we will be back, and we'll try to finish up the villains and orcs discussion. Maggie had wanted to bring in the Rings of Power stuff as well, so we are. She will be glad not to have missed that part. So I'll pick that up with Maggie at the beginning of next time. Thanks everybody for joining us. Appreciate you being here as always, and we'll see you next Thursday. Bye now.